I'm Julie Anderson, Editor-in-Chief of the Orlando Sentinel. We decided to do this forum after we reported a series called Toxic Secret about a little-known contaminant called 1,4-dioxane that contaminated some water, drinking water, in northwest Seminole County, Sanford, and Lake Mary. We got such a response from the readers that we decided we needed to open it up and let the community talk to us, ask questions. We wanted to make our reporters available and public officials so we could get more information out. Before I introduce the co-moderators, I wanted to thank Seminole State College for giving access to their campus. I needed to say that they're not affiliated with the Orlando Sentinel and they do not endorse our content, but they were gracious enough to provide a forum. So our co-moderators are Roger Simmons, Managing Editor of the Orlando Sentinel. He's been with the paper for 30 years, and he was a main editor on the series. We also have Tammy Fields, who is co-anchor of News 13 and has been with the station for 7 years. News 13 is a news partner of the Sentinels, and they're helping us stream, which you'll hear about that in just a minute. So I'm going to turn it over to Roger and Tammy.
We only have 2 microphones, so you're going to see a lot of sharing tonight between Tammy and myself and the panel as well. I got to hold it up here close. Welcome to our event. We want to tell you about a couple of things. This is being live streamed right now on orlandosentinel.com and Orlando Sentinel's Facebook page. After the event is over, since you're here not watching it, you can go home and watch it. It will be recorded on our website and also the Facebook page. And we just want to thank the panelists for being here with us. We invited a number of people that we thought would be important to talk about this issue, and these people graciously showed up. I will tell you that we did invite representatives from the Florida Department of Environmental Regulation and also from the Florida Department of Health, and they declined to appear. So I applaud these people for coming here tonight to talk about this issue. So thank you. And Tammy, do you want to introduce the panel?
Sure. Well, we can share duties.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. We are so glad that you're here tonight. Hopefully everyone is doing well, you're surviving the heat, and you're ready to turn up the heat in here to ask some questions and to hear some answers. So I'm going to go right down the line here, and if you would, just kind of wave when I say your name. Kevin Spear with the Orlando Sentinel is one of our panelists. Caroline Catherman is one of our panelists as well. Martin Comas is one of our panelists. Art Woodruff, Mayor of Sanford. Scott Rankin, Lake Mary Chief Water Plant Operator. And I'll let you pick it up.
All right, let's see who's down there. Mr. Jake, because I'm told not to call him Mr. Jake Varn, who is representing Sanford. Okay, all right. Jake. Lee Constantine, Seminole County Commissioner. And then also Mary Thomas, who is the Vice President of Carrillo Engineering, which is a consultant group that Seminole County has hired to help with the 1,4-dioxane issue. And what we're going to do tonight, first we're going to show you a video that the Orlando Sentinel put together about this issue to kind of set the table so we all have a good background to talk about this issue. When we come back, we're going to ask our reporters a couple questions. Then we're going to talk to the officials who are here. And then we're going to take your questions. When you came in, you were given a card where you could write down a question. And basically, we have some people here who will gather those if you are still writing them. And they're going to go through those and hand those to us toward the end of the evening. And basically, it's just to sort out so we don't get 5 of the same question. They're going to pile them that way, compile them. So I think without further ado, we'll get started. So this is a video we did for this series. It was produced by the Sentinel, and hopefully they'll see a good overview of the issue.
The chemical in the tap water of the people living in Lake Mary, Sanford, and Seminole County, it comes from deep underground in this place called the Floridan Aquifer. It's a rocky place full of water, full of rainwater, and it's where Central Florida gets most of its drinking water. But the story that's important here is how the chemical that is contaminating drinking water in Seminole County, how it got there. The stuff is called 1,4 dioxane, and most people have never heard of it.
Anyone who lives in the US has probably been exposed to this chemical at some point. It's in personal care products, it's in shampoo, it's in cleaning products, like hundreds and hundreds of products. And federal authorities categorize it as a likely carcinogen, which means it's likely that it causes cancer. Now, we've really only proven that in animal studies and rodent studies, but the strongest evidence shows that it impacts the livers and the kidneys.
It's kind of a boutique chemical from an industrial standpoint, and it has some remarkable characteristics or properties. It can dissolve completely into water and become essentially water. Sanford's water wells have been pulling up 1,4-dioxane. And they hired an expert consultant to try to figure out where 1,4-dioxane is underground. And the map they drew, this map, depicts 1,4-dioxane in the ground or deep underground, starting at the Siemens telephone component factory. So down at the bottom in this map is where the Siemens plant was. It's between Reinhardt Road and Interstate 4. A side note to that is that the same map drawn by Sanford's expert shows that plume of poison underground is also moved to the west far enough to wrap around a few of Seminole County's drinking wells. There's some contention here. Siemens and other former owners of the plant say that no, there's no proof that the 1,4-dioxane that has gone to the north is from the factory. And this is where Sanford wants the state of Florida to step in and once and for all figure out where this chemical is and where it came from and who should deal with it as far as cleaning it up.
In 1968, General Dynamics, which at the time was one of the largest defense contractors in the United States, they purchased about 56 acres of old scrubland and old citrus groves near what is today Lake Mary, just off of where Reinhardt Road sits today. The property was basically out in the middle of nowhere, and they built an 89,000 square foot plant. The reason for the plant was that so Stromberg Carlson, a subsidiary of General Dynamics, could build circuit boards for telephone equipment. At the time, General Dynamics scored a big contract with the Walt Disney Company, and at that time, Walt Disney was planning to build its Magic Kingdom theme park there, which wouldn't open until about 3 years later. For Seminole County, it was a big win, because at that time, Seminole County was trying to move away from Orange County's shadow and start building its own high-tech corridor in that area. Now, what Stromberg Carlson did at the time was they manufactured circuit boards and telephone switching equipment. This is going back to the old rotary phones and push-button phones. And when someone would make a call, the switching equipment would transfer the call from the caller to the receiver. And that's what the circuit boards would do. By the early 1980s, there was over 1,600 employees at this facility, including engineers, designers, and factory workers. The company, General Dynamics, sold this Stromberg Carlson facility over to a British company called Plessey. And eventually, by 2001, the Siemens Corporation is now the owner of the property and also the manufacturing facility. Today, it looks much, much different. There are hospitals out there by Orlando Health. There are several new home subdivisions. So it doesn't look anything at all today like it did back in the 1970s and 1980s.
But from the late 1960s up until it closed in 2003, there was a period of time when it used solvents, chlorinated solvents, which are known to be very harmful to humans. Meanwhile, 1,4-dioxane would be added to other chemicals so that those chemicals did not dissolve or destroy newly made components at the Siemens plant in Lake Mary.
Every day, this assembly line would be working, sometimes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These manufactured circuit boards would come right off the assembly line. They would be cleaned, packaged, and delivered out to the clients. And then eventually these old solvents were put into these 55-gallon metal drums. These old metal drums were stored outside. They were sometimes stacked. And eventually, when the piles became too big, they were moved to other areas of the property. One of the employees that we spoke with had said that many times as these barrels were stacked, that after a rainstorm, they could actually smell these solvents leaking from these 55-gallon drums.
There's a lawsuit that says it was disposed of in other ways, that used chemicals were taken outside and just thrown on the ground with the expectation that they would evaporate into the air. And there's other indications that it was simply poured into drains, local sewer drains. In the end, it's not clear how it got into the ground, but it did. And when investigators went in there in the early 2000s, they found the most concentrated pockets of chlorinated solvents and 1,4-dioxin directly beneath the factory floor. In 2001, the city of Lake Mary dug a new drinking water well. And when they did that, they tested it and they found bad stuff, chlorinated solvents. But they never thought to look for 1,4-dioxane in that mess of chemicals in that newly drilled water well. So the owners of the Siemens plant agreed with Lake Mary to build a really fancy water treatment system that would remove chlorinated solvents from that well water. And by 2005, that system was turned on, and they started using it. And they used it heavily for years. What they didn't know was that it was full of 1,4-dioxane that infiltrated the entire water system of Lake Mary and went to all homes and businesses and schools in the city.
But at this point, there's people that have been exposed and they can't be unexposed. Of course, the bigger concern is when it seeps into drinking water from these industrial sites, because there has never been a study on the impact of drinking 1,4-dioxane in humans, despite the fact that millions of Americans have this chemical in their drinking water. There's an advisory level set by the State Department of Health, but it's not binding in any way. There's not really consequences if you go over that level, if that level's higher in your water supply. There's really no uniform regulations for this, and we don't know at what level it might cause cancer. There are some states like New York that have set limits for 1,4-dioxane in cosmetic products and in drinking water, but the numbers being thrown out by different regulatory agencies around the world are pretty different.
But the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has deemed it likely to cause cancer. And so they have set a very low limit, a very tiny concentration that they say is okay in drinking water. And it's kind of hard to wrap your head around this, but they measure that very tiny concentration as less than 1 part per billion, or in other words, less than 1 part 1,4-dioxane to a billion parts of water. They set the limit at 0.35 parts per billion. It's incredibly tiny. And that equates to about 1 8-ounce cup of 1,4-dioxane in 150 million gallons of water. So the research is not great as far as what 1,4-dioxane does for human health. That research needs an upgrade. And Yale University has recently started a big investigation on what health concerns arise from 1,4-dioxane.
So they're going to monitor people that have been exposed to it over the long term to see if they can get a cause and effect relationship, to see if they can find evidence that it is causing cancer in people or kidney or liver toxicity. They're also going to try to find some biomarkers and be able to link that. And this is really the first time that there's been a concerted effort to take this chemical seriously after decades and decades of knowing that it is likely to cause cancer in humans. But we're not going to have answers until 2027. So science is sort of playing catch up.
So even when 1,4-dioxane was discovered in 2013 in Seminole County, nobody knew what to do really. There were no regulations for 1,4-dioxane in drinking water. The 3 utilities in Seminole County were perplexed, shocked. They reached out to the state for help, and they didn't really get any for a couple of years. They got no direction. They all acted independently. They didn't collaborate with each other. And basically what they did was they turned off the wells, the drinking water wells that had the most 1,4-dioxane in them. By doing that, they reduced the levels of 1,4-dioxane substantially, but Lake Mary still had quite a bit in its drinking water. The thing about 1,4-dioxane is that because it dissolves completely into water, it can move pretty freely underground in the Floridan aquifer, and it's hard to get out. But when utilities pump it up in their drinking water wells, the standard approach to treating water in much of Florida absolutely does not work for 1,4-dioxane. It is a really tough chemical to get out of drinking water. What it requires is some of the most advanced treatment you'll find in all of Florida. It relies on dosing water with hydrogen peroxide and then cooking that water with a strong dose of ultraviolet light. In that fashion, it burns out, so to speak, the 1,4-dioxane. But no ordinary water treatment plant in Florida can do that. So here we are today, and a lot needs to be resolved yet in terms of identifying where 1,4-dioxane is moving underground, what the concentrations are, and what to do about it. Sanford's practically in a panic about this. Lake Mary has a brand new water treatment plant that cost a lot. It was paid for by Siemens. It cost an estimated $40 million. But going forward, if there's anything that might come of this, it seems that Florida goes through these convulsions where they have chemical spills or environmental mishaps of some sort, and that results in the legislature coming up with a law that mandates more transparency. That is, if in certain circumstances you have a chemical spill or other kind of environmental contamination, then you have to report it. You have to be transparent about it. In the case of Seminole County, where people in the know, people who are expert with water, they had no idea about 1,4-dioxane. And I think very clearly almost no residents in Seminole County knew of 1,4-dioxane in their water. But meanwhile, where the Siemens plant is in West Lake Mary, there's a lot of redevelopment going on. So the landscape is being altered entirely. A hospital is being built, and apartments, assisted living. It's incredibly different there now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. The whole episode is literally being paved over, almost to be forgotten before anybody even really knew what happened there.
That was our video that we did to kind of talk about the series. And yes, I would applaud that. Rich Pope, who is up there doing our live stream in the baseball cap, he's responsible for editing it and did a fantastic job. So thank you, Rich, for that. So this kind of sets the stage for what we want to talk about tonight. And first, we want to talk to the reporters who did this series a little bit and ask some questions. And I think, Kevin, the question I have first to lead off is, and there's a microphone down there you're going to have to share, unfortunately, sorry. Pass it down. But Kevin, when did you first find out about this?
Let's see if I can make this work. Let's switch, make that work. I don't really want to hear myself talk anymore after this long thing. I've been covering Florida's environment for almost 30 years, focusing on water, Florida and aquifer utilities, regulations, and so forth. So early this year, I picked up a little bit information about what we're here to talk about tonight, and that my first sense was, this is a little embarrassing. I've got to call my boss, the guy who pays me, and tell him there's a big deal going on in Seminole County, and I don't know a thing about it. But with the background I have in environmental reporting, I pretty quickly realized that this is big. I don't have anything to compare it to in Central Florida in any event. There are cities that have had wells impaired by, say, some ingredients of gasoline or pesticides, but for two cities and a big part of a county to be troubled, impaired with this chemical, there's no comparison for it. So we jumped in. That's how we got into this.
And then Caroline, one of the issues we had was trying to find out information about the medical aspects of this, and you're our medical and health reporter. How much of a trouble did you have finding someone to be able to talk about this?
Oh gosh, I think that I reached out to dozens of people. There's very few scientists that have done research on this topic, and even fewer that have done research recently. I got sort of lucky. There was very recently, in 2022, a center at Yale University was started to, that was dedicated to researching this chemical. And I was able to link up with the lead investigator there. And he was, just a wealth of knowledge. But in one way, my job was easy because there wasn't much to find. But in another way, it is very difficult to categorize the health risks of this chemical just because all the studies have been done in, animals. It's 2 years and various rodents like rats, whereas there's been just very little research looking at the human impact of this.
Martin, this question is for you. What can you tell us about the former Siemens plant in Lake Mary that really seems to be at the center of the story?
Well, this plant was built in 1968 by General Dynamics, and it was built for its subsidiary Stromberg Carlson. Stromberg Carlson at that time was up in Rochester, New York, and their factory up there was having a lot of their union employees that worked in the factory have gone on several strikes. So General Dynamics was looking for a more, coming down to Florida where it was a little bit more difficult for unions to go ahead and have strikes. So that was one of the reasons why General Dynamics picked this location off of Reinhardt Road. The other reason why is because General Dynamics at that time got a huge contract with, or its subsidiary Stromberg Carlson got a big contract with the Walt Disney Company at that time in 1968. As we all know, Walt Disney World was building Walt Disney World, the theme park. So this is just a great location. In 1968, if you go down Reinhardt Road back then, if you go back in time, there was just basically nothing at this site. There was just old citrus groves, scrubland. In fact, it was just basically out in the middle of nowhere, if you can believe that. The landscape looked a lot different than it does today. So they built a big factory out there. The employees had to drive from other areas to get out to this place, which they called basically Ugly Acres, because there wasn't really much to look at. I-4 was just built, and so they built a big factory, and they manufactured these circuit boards for telephone equipment. And as part of that whole process on their assembly line, they used solvents, and these solvents contained a lot of chemicals, TCE, TCA, and also later on this 1,4-dioxane. And the allegation is that they were careless with these solvents. They also, General Dynamics, when they built the plant, they put in 2 wells on the property, and they also put a wastewater treatment plant on there. But the allegations, according to lawsuits that we dug up, they were careless with the solvents, and there's allegations that they poured them into the ground. The used solvents were then put into these 55-gallon metal drums, and they were stacked outside, according to former employees that we talked to, and they leaked into the ground, and nobody back then really thought anything of it. And little was known back then of the harm that these chemicals could do.
Thank you, Martin. So we've seen the reporting, we've read the articles, we've seen the video piece. Let's talk tonight about the solutions. And I'm going to ask this of every single panelist, not our journalist here, but our panelists that are here. What is the best way out of this toxic trouble? Let's start right now with the mayor of Sanford.
Easy question there for you, sir.
Well, first of all, it's to have DEP identify who is responsible for this, so we know who should be paying for it. So far, our ratepayers have been carrying the cost of us doing the research, and our staff has been dogged at going after this and trying to figure out what's going on and how do we protect our water supply. We know there are treatment options, but they're expensive. What we need to do is figure out how much of it can be cleaned up, because as we've heard, it's in the water and it's spreading around. We're not going to be able to get rid of all of it, but if we can reduce what's in the ground, that will help us all out. The city is already working on plans for a treatment plant because we know it's already in one of our wells and it's headed our way. So there's three parts. We've got to identify who's responsible. We've got to clean up as much as we can, and then we have to treat our water so that it remains safe.
Mr. Rankin, you have the new toy on the block that everybody wants, because you have this new estimated $40 million water plant that helps filter out this, and it's not unlike most water plants around the area. It's a special plant.
Yeah, it's the only one in the state of Florida that treats this.
Right.
And it doesn't filter it out, it removes it.
It removes it. So how did you end up getting that plant? And what recommendation would you make to the others about how to get something similar?
Well, I can't speak of how the city, all the steps they went through, because I was hired right when the pilot study was done and designed. So I went through all design, startup, and training of the staff. So unfortunately, I couldn't answer the whole question.
In your role?
I got the answer. First off, before I answer it, I want to make an observation that I'm glad to see some young people here. My definition of young people is 55 or younger. I'm not one of them, and for people 55 and older, we are basically unaffected because something's going to get us any day now anyway. But you young people, this program should be directed to you, and you should be getting upset about it. But having said that, in 2005, the city of Lake Mary entered into an agreement with the three responsible parties to investigate the 1,4-dioxin, and so they started investigating, and again, that's 2005. Come along, and so they have been doing studies and all, which at least my good friend Kevin made note of the fact that they discovered these contaminants, if you will, in 2001 when they were drilling a well they referred to as LM5. Now, so in 2005, they have this deal with the three responsible parties to do further investigations. Somewhere in the process, DEP gets involved with the process, and on July the 15th, 2016, they enter into what they call a restoration agreement, which is typically is an enforcement tool that the Department of Environmental Protection utilizes. And I might just to dazzle you with a few facts. In an earlier life, I was a secretary of the predecessor to DEP, and in those days it was called the Department of Environmental Regulation. So I know a little bit about the subject matter and how the agency functions, especially when I got there. They couldn't spell groundwater, and I had to convince them that since 90% of the people in this state drink groundwater, shouldn't we be interested in protecting the most valuable resource we have? And so people don't like to talk about it, but I've been a water nerd for more years than most of the folks here have been alive, but nonetheless. So DEP does their deal on July the 15th, 2016. Followed shortly thereafter, Lake Mary enters their agreement in January of 2017, and that's the agreement where the three responsible parties, one, agreed to build the fancy plant you get to operate nowadays, who, depending on who you want to believe, costs about $40 million. And their plant, what do you handle, about 4 million gallons a day?
We average 3.2.
3.2, okay, I hyperbolized slightly, okay? But the point is, not only did they pay for the $40 million to build the plant, but they also agreed that they would pay the operation and maintenance cost in perpetuity. Now, that's a sweetheart deal. Some people might call it a bribe to keep them quiet, but, you know, I leave it to you to judge for yourself what it was. Meanwhile, DEP starts their process to find out where this, you know, all the ramifications, and they're doing it under their, quote, restoration agreement, which they finally negotiated with the department. So that, I think, responds to your question, right? Okay, what's the question from me? The solution? Oh, you want the solution?
Yes,
Well,
what's the solution?
Contrary to what some people think, having spent several years in state government, the last time the federal government ever did anything for me was the 12th of never. So, you know, I don't have a whole lot of confidence in them. And if you go to EPA, maybe 5 years from now, you might learn something. The people that have got the horsepower to do this problem, and unfortunately, we haven't seen anything in the paper about either one of them. Actually, there's 3 entities, but one of them's partnered with the other one. But if our good Governor DeSantis's departments, the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Health, and if you'd like, I'd be glad to read you what they're charged with. But they're charged, one is charged with protecting our water resources, DEP, and the Department of Health is charged with protecting public health. Those two have the horsepowers. They've known that this dioxin has been in the water. The Department of Health did a study in 2010 about the water quality up at Lake Mary, and they concluded, well, if you're around the 0.35, you might get a little sick, but, you know, a little illness probably wouldn't hurt you. But then as the years have progressed, they've now come along and said, you should not have more than 0.35 parts per million. But it's not really a regulation. It's an advisory opinion, and they call it the HAL. But the point in all this is, if you want to solve the problem, you need to get the Department of Health. Somebody needs to kick them in the derriere, and DEP, the same thing. And who knows, even if you got some of your local legislators to say, folks, we have a problem. And the problem isn't just in Seminole County. This is a statewide problem. We're just the tip of the iceberg, okay? We've got serious water quality problems throughout the state of Florida that we need to be dealing with, as opposed to putting our head in the sand and being an ostrich. With that, I think I've answered your question. And if you have any questions?
I think Mr. Spear has a question.
Jake, I can't let all that go by. I'll just say briefly that until we reported this and had our Toxic Secret series in the paper, you did not have the constituency to pressure DEP, and here you have them now today. So getting it out in the open, I think,
I
is...
give you credit. You just missed the target, you know. We got to get DEP and the Department of Health and start beating on them. And I say that very respectfully because I can't beat on them too bad because they've got all the horsepower, and I want them to be friendly, so I can't be too negative about there's, you know, that's politics for you. You know, you've got to be careful of what we say about the folks in Tallahassee because, you know, they have a long memory, especially those that are trying to get reelected, you know.
Before we continue to go on with the commissioner, if you have a cell phone, and I know some of us have too, can you please put it on vibrate? I know for many of you, you need to be able to see your phone, but we want to get some of these people on record, and we want their audio to be crystal clear. Thank you.
As Jake said, first of all, he was ringing, so somebody was listening and is already calling him. I don't know what it is, but I could just say, you know, whatever Jake says. Jake and I serve on the 1,000 Friends of Florida together, and the one thing that I have learned for a long time is you don't question his knowledge about this issue, and I thank him, and we're very honored to have him as part of Seminole County, Sanford, in looking at the problem and how we can solve it. I can't speak for my fellow commissioners. I can simply tell you what Seminole County has done publicly through the county manager, through the commission, since we have been made aware of this. And as I said, I'm very pleased that there has been so much action initiated since then. I do have, one of the things we have done is hired a consultant to help us with the solution. I do have our consultant here, and maybe she can talk more about other solutions. But we, in just the past weeks, have established a water quality dashboard. We have requested EPA to adopt tougher standards, although I concur personally with Jake that it's going to be the DEP and the DOH that has to have the firepower and the money and the time, because this is not something we can wait around for in the state of Florida. And again, this is not a Seminole County issue. This is a state of Florida issue. We have already started aggressive testing throughout our system, which we had testing, but we've made even more aggressive testing. We are working and cooperating with the cities even more than we ever have. We've, as I said, brought in consultants. We are doing internal and external communications analysis to ensure transparency. We are investigating going after the polluters. And we are establishing an education program with the owners of private wells so that they can look at their own wells and protect themselves.
Is it my turn to talk about a solution?
It's your turn.
Okay. I think my daughters are watching, so I just wanted to make everybody know that by definition, I'm a young person, and that makes me very, very excited. Thank you.
Under 55.
Thank you so much for that. I think just to recap and say in my own words what I've already heard many of the panel members say, and that is this is not just a Seminole County issue, it's not just a Lake Mary issue, it's not a Sanford issue. This is a regional issue, and as such, I think the solution is collaboration. There is a number of data points out there available to us. There has been groundwater flow modeling done to identify the plumes. We've already identified one treatment option that's available to us. And in my view, every improvement, every action one utility takes will have a direct reaction and a direct implication on our neighbors. We can look at treatment options, we can look at shutting down wells. There are several things that we can look at from a technical perspective, but I think first and foremost, from a community standpoint, we need to be collaborating, sharing data amongst ourselves, and disseminating that information.
Let me pass it back down. What we didn't say, though, is that these solutions are expensive. And so when you take cities like Lake Mary, Sanford, and even Seminole County, you're talking about drilling these monitor wells that can easily run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. We, Sanford and Lake Mary, do not have the financial capability to get and have a fight with a 500-pound gorilla like the three responsible parties. And so, with all due respect, unless you've got a deeper pocket than I know about, you know, the county is in the same boat we are. There's only a limited amount, and the only one that can deal with that 500-pound gorilla are the Department of Health and the DEP.
I'm glad that you left it right there, because I want to know, and I'm speaking on behalf of many of the people that are in this audience, they didn't create this problem. They get that it's expensive. But what can be done to hold those folks accountable, anybody, so that they can pay the tab and not the people who have the water bills?
You can sue them, but you pack on the 500-pound gorilla. You know, think about what a deep pocket Siemens and General Dynamics, these guys will spend billions. Hey, they gave these guys $40 million, you know, to do a treatment plant. If you want to do the treatment plant we're talking about in Sanford, we're talking about somewhere approximately $80 million. And where is a city that has an annual revenue from the water system of $10 million a year going to come up with $80 million? Now, to their credit, suddenly DEP found some money that we're in line to do, and so hopefully we can get that. But the point is, why don't we talk about those three responsible parties and what in the hell are they doing other than denying that they've got any responsibility? Now, what no one has talked about is that in July of this year, because we kept nudging them. They found DEP, after telling the 3 responsible parties to drill 2 deep monitoring well clusters, and they told them, pound sand, DEP, we're not doing it because we don't think we need them. DEP goes out and drills 2 wells. They call them DEP-F and DEP-G. In the process, lo and behold, they discovered that there's 1,4-dioxin in one of the wells they drilled. Now, that was in July, and that was what they sent us by way of a, quote, draft report. They still haven't finished the final report. And to me, the $65 or $64 question to us oldest folks that you want to ask is, okay, DEP, what are you going to do next? Now that you've established that the 1,4-dioxin is getting away from the Seaman site, what are you going to do about it? And DEP is the one that's got the horsepower to go after the 3 responsible parties and get them to start doing a full investigation of this 1,4-dioxin. And that's where the heat needs to be applied.
Right. I just wanted to point out in our video, this is actually the test well being that they're doing. We happened to come across them as they were doing that. But the question I have is, you all have talked about how you need to get the state to get involved with this. Part of the problem that it seemed like in our reporting was that Sanford was doing its own thing, Lake Mary was doing its own thing, Seminole was doing its own thing. Are you all talking now about a coordinated response to the state to get them to do something?
I can only speak for for myself, and I would say this. I talked with my good friend, the commissioner, about this problem on several occasions. I don't know that I know anybody from Lake Mary. I mean, they basically solved their problem with their plant. So the 2 people that are in the hot seat are Sanford and the county, and I think that I would
Let's
say
hear from them.
Pardon?
Let's hear from them.
Commissioner.
The answer is yes. We've the county manager has already opened up discussions with both Lake Mary, Sanford, and the other cities. And as I said, in what I've already talked about earlier about what we're doing, we are investigating going after the polluters.
I have nothing to add other than, as I understand it, the utility leadership is collaborating on technical solutions and comparing notes in that way.
So I am curious about the Lake Mary plant, and it has really knocked down the level of 1,4-dioxin in drinking water. But my question is, what if it breaks? What if there's a shortage of hydrogen peroxide? What if the main operator gets in a crash on the way to work and the plant shuts down? What happens?
If your plant shuts down.
The easiest answer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So all water facilities have emergency contingencies. So we have interconnects with Seminole County, with Sanford. We can go to them and use their water for the time being until we get that corrected.
Right answer.
Thank you.
All right, well, I think we have some questions from the audience that we'll go to. We have 9 so far. They are wonderful. This is Carolyn Guinness, who's our local news editor, and Cassie Armstrong, who is our sports and features editor. And they went through some of these. So thank you for doing that. Let's see. You want to read that one?
Sure. This is a question from Gary. Gary asks, how can we be sure that the water purity standards in place today are adequate for our safe water? Are there limits to 1,4-dioxane sufficient? Are they based on science, medicine, testing, and supported by technical papers, peer review, and public notice? Thank you, Gary, for your question.
Anyone want to answer that?
Well, I can tell you that the Department of Health, the first piece of paper I saw where they took a position was in the year 2010, where they made a recommendation that the health advisory level be at 0.35. And that number has been consistently used. They did health consultation reports in the year 2010, in the year 2018, and everyone's considering EPA has bought into the 0.35 parts per billion, and so that's, from my perspective, has been generally accepted as the number that everybody should. It's not a regulation, it's not a federal requirement, it's just a recommendation. And so you may see people, exceed it. The good news I can report to you, since April of 2016, the city of Sanford has not exceeded the 0.35 parts per billion. And in fact, there's only one occasion when they exceeded 0.25. So Sanford has done, in my good old Brooksville redneck, they've done a damn good job of making sure that that level is kept down below that health advisory level.
Right. And was that from turning off wells that are still contaminated?
Well, there's no standard for a well. The 0.35 is what is the quality of the water coming out of your water treatment plant. There is no regulation, and it's the, pardon the expression, the solution to pollution is dilution, okay? And so you take bad water and mix it with good water and it becomes acceptable. That's been something that the engineers have lived with since the beginning of time. And it may not be a good solution, but it works and everybody has bought into it.
Gary, did we answer this question? Did the panelists answer this question to your liking? You're welcome. Thank you for asking that question.
Cool. And then one more follow-up before we get to the next question, but to the Seminole County representatives. We know at the recent commission meeting that talked about this issue, you guys all passed a resolution to send a letter to the EPA asking them to take a closer look at this. Did you get any response to that?
No,
Short answer.
not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I want to, say that, but no, I don't know. I want to reiterate what Jake said, if anybody did not hear it. That 0.35 parts per billion is a recommendation, not a requirement. They have requirements on 90 plus different contaminants, but not this one. This one is very recent. I can say with assurance, and again, I will defer to our consultant, but no, none of our wells have been at the 3.35 since 2016, and that was just one at one particular time. The interesting thing is here, when you talk about 0.35 parts per billion, in Canada, I think the recommendation is 50 parts per building.
I can up you. Alaska is 700.
So
700.
not 0.35 parts per billion, 700. I mean, it's all over the board, and I think everybody welcomes this health study that has been referred to from, from Yale, because we can, obviously, until we know more, we're in the dark as much as everybody else.
I'll just add to what Commissioner Constantine said, and that is for Seminole County customers of Seminole County provided water, water is safe. The water has and remains below the health advisory level by at least half consistently, and has for the past many, many, many years. So for at least those who receive water from Seminole County system, your levels are very low.
Let me make a footnote. You should not be confused, because DEP also they do have a standard for what they call the groundwater cleanup target level. So in other words, if they find the groundwater contaminated, they have established, by rule, this is a rule now, not a recommendation, they have a standard of 3.2 parts per billion as when they're going to go in and require somebody to clean it up, and that's the level they're going to clean it up to. Now, you and I can do math, and if you take 3.2 divided by 0.35, it's going to be something less than 10, probably around 9 times as much water as you want somebody to be drinking. But that's the rule that's on the books.
So just a quick follow-up on Ms. Thomas's comment about the water being safe, which I think we're all happy that the water is safe now. But does anyone on the panel have any idea how long the water was contaminated before this testing started?
Well, look at it this way. If you look at the data, they stopped using the 1,4-dioxin in 1980. Now, so from 1968 to whenever they started, so sometime prior to 1980, so, think of yourself like in Lake Mary when they got their plan in what, 2021? Yes. So, so since 1980 to 2021, only 41 years for you good folks in Lake Mary, you've been drinking contaminated water. Good luck, But for the rest of us, we are fortunate because fortunately we aren't surrounded by the 1,4-dioxin. We're a couple miles away, and the county's a little bit further away. But the poor folks in Lake Mary, they're the ones that were sucking weenies, folks. They were in trouble.
So kind of along those lines, we have a question from Gabrielle.
And I think this question is right on time because we need to kind of dive into this a little bit more. Gabrielle's city of residence, Wekiva, she says, where should a private well owner get their water tested, and is there a test, in fact, for humans? There are lots of people on well water.
Well, I think test it. Sometimes they may charge you, but I don't know. Lee will know better than me.
Contact the Seminole County Health Department.
Contact the Seminole County Health Department. Gabrielle, does that answer your question?
It's 10 weeks to wait to get your well tested.
10 weeks. And there are a lot of people on well water. I'm one of them. How do we know what's in our water?
Get it tested.
And wait 10 weeks. Private testing? I need a water expert to tell me if that's good enough. Jay?
Of course, that's who
Okay.
we go to. The city of Sanford sends they have people that do their sampling. Now, some local governments are large enough to have their own laboratories and do the testing, but most of the folk, and you gotta understand, this 1,4-dioxin, there's only a handful of laboratories in the state of Florida that can even test for it. I may be stretching the truth here. The last time I heard, it was maybe 4 laboratories that are certified to test for 1,4-dioxin. And Bill, can you give me a yes or no? Maybe, definite maybe, folks. Definite.
So before you even ask for the test, you're saying, I need to ask if this contaminant is being tested, right?
Right.
I did want to have a footnote on that, and I said this. I did want a footnote on this, and I said this. Seminole County, the county manager did announce that they are working on an education program with the Department of Health for private well owners. That was one of the things that we've already instituted and working on. I can't tell you where we are right now, but I'm saying we started, we're developing it, and it should be, we should have some information about that very soon.
Well, most of you read in the stories that appeared in the Orlando Sentinel where the former family and how she lost 3 dogs and she's got terminal cancer. So it was the city of Sanford that went and found those people and tested their wells to tell them they had 1,4-dioxin. It wasn't the health department, it wasn't DEP, it wasn't the Department of Health. We likewise went to the Bell Timaquan Apartments, which have 6 irrigation wells, and in their irrigation wells, they found one of them that had 40 parts per billion. Okay, that's more than 10 times as much. Well, maybe that's 100 times as much. Let me get my math right. There in one of their irrigation wells, and that was what Sanford done. It wasn't done by DEP, it wasn't done by the Department of Health, but it was Sanford trying to do the right thing for the people in this area as we were searching for where's this dadgum stuff coming from.
We put up on the screen contact information, Florida Department of Health, for those who are trying to get some testing, but also nice to hear that Seminole County is helping with that. This is a good question, and perhaps I think Mr. Rankin, you can answer this, I hope. This is from Joe, who lives in Lake Mary, Markham's Woods area. Does reverse osmosis filters remove 1,4-dioxane from our drinking water? If not, what types of alternatives does a homeowner have to detect and remove this?
So reverse osmosis will remove it. I don't have any personal experience with the home reverse osmosis. What I know about reverse osmosis, it does reject water, So that water is being rejected. Now you're putting it down a drain or something that's possibly now going to the wastewater facilities.
So I know that one thing we heard anecdotally was that obviously people who read the stories and were very concerned about their water immediately start calling, and I'm just using name Culligan or some of these other peoples to come get me a water filter to get this out of here. So, can you get a traditional filter at your home that you think could filter that out? I see the mayor shaking his head.
I don't know of any on the market. There may be some carbon filters out there. If you have lower levels, it may reduce some of it. It's not going to remove it all.
Mr. Mayor, to say on that?
May I respond? Maybe I went to a different school of engineering, but reverse osmosis is what you use to get salt out of the water so you can make it potable, and I've been involved with the construction of such a plant. But I do not know of any instance where reverse osmosis has been used to take 1,4-dioxin out of water. Now, maybe you went to a different engineering school than I did, but the folks that taught me didn't talk about that working. So I'll leave it to you to go find the answer. But I don't think there's a simple, honestly, there's not a simple fix for people that are on a private well, as best I know. It's a very expensive proposition because this is very modern technology. And if somebody wants to make a lot of money, they would do it. But the best thing you can do is hook up to a municipal or county system as opposed to a private well. Because there's all kinds of things that influence your private well, including those of you that live in septic tanks, which that's another issue we can talk about in the next session we have, okay?
Briefly, Caroline and I hunted this down. The question of whether reverse osmosis will remove 1,4-dioxin, and it does, a lot of it, but not all of it. And systems vary as well. So some of the toughest advocates out there for clean water don't recommend reverse osmosis. They say, call up your city, your county, their utilities, and get on them to fix it because they really, the only ones who have access to the technology to clean up your water.
Thank you. Thank you for that added perspective. This is an anonymous question. It says, where exactly are the affected areas in Seminole County?
Who do you want to believe?
You pull up Sanford's map that we have done, and it shows what our experts say the plume is.
We have our experts have identified a plume that I think appeared in one of the articles that the Orlando Sentinel put out. It was our version of where the plume was, which, quite frankly, DEP didn't agree with, but I have more confidence in what our expert said than what the folks at DEP said, to be honest.
Actually, two experts.
Yeah, we have actually, as I think I mentioned earlier, not only did we have an expert that did it, but we also went out and had someone do a peer review that looked at our experts and the DEP experts, and my gosh, they said our experts were correct and DEP was wrong. So who do you believe? You know, I want to take the one that has the most impact on me. I'd rather be wrong and be safe than be wrong and end up polluting somebody's well.
We have the map up right here.
Yeah, we can maybe point out where Seminole County's wells are in the lower left corner there, right within the plume. And then Sanford's,
Make it clear that that's I-4, so.
yeah, okay, that's Interstate 4. You can see the former factory down at the bottom in the strange looking shape right there. And then Sanford's wells, Twin Lakes wells, you go up to the right, right a little higher, little higher, right in there. Those are Sanford's wells. So they're poking into this plume of 1,4-dioxin as delineated by Sanford's consultants.
Does that answer the anonymous question?
Yes, a resounding yes. Yes, very good.
This question is from Scott in Lake Mary area. Is
or will there be third-party independent testing to ensure our safety? Key word being independent testing from the government.
I don't drink that stuff.
That question is to me.
anyone can answer that question.
What's the question?
Well, is there going to be independent testing?
Will there be third-party independent testing to ensure our safety?
The Department of Health is taking samples and doing studies. The Department of Environmental Protection is taking samples and doing studies. Lake Mary is taking samples. Sanford is taking samples. Seminole County is taking samples. Again, going back to the original comment, I think if we're all sharing data and we're all reviewing each other's work over time, it's all going to, there will be a culmination of factual data and graphics that are consistent with one another. So I'm not so sure it's necessary to get a third party or an outsider in, as long as we're all sharing data. These are essentially independent labs and independent sampling individuals taking this information. And I would like to comment on the plume graphic, and that is to be mindful that the plume itself originated in the superficial aquifer, which means it's very, very shallow. The deeper your well, the less likely it is that you are impacted by this contamination. So yes, it is important to understand the horizontal extent of the plume. It's also very, very important to understand the depth of the plume.
Well, here's what's important from Sanford's perspective. Sanford's wells are very deep, and one of the problems I've had with DEP is to put deep monitor wells in, because some of Sanford's shallower wells are at least and y'all need to pay close attention if you look at this, because there's two that the experts will confuse you. In one hand, they'll give you the depth in terms of feet below land surface, and the other one will give you in feet below NGVD, okay? Two different standards, and so you need to make sure when you start talking about the depth of your wells. The last time DEP did F&G, they put those wells down to about 400 feet level, which is NGVD. Sanford's shallowest wells start at a little bit around 400 feet and go deeper. And their later wells go even deeper. And so that's what we've been complaining to DEP about, that their test wells weren't doing them any good. They went out and drilled a well that went down 300 feet and said, look, no 1,4-dioxin. And I said, no, sucker, you didn't go deep enough. You know? And so finally, for the first time, they did 2 deep wells with F&G, and lo and behold, they found 1,4-dioxin. And so the other factor that you need to take, that Kevin didn't point out about 1,4-dioxin, not only does it dissolve in water, but it moves faster than water does, and so, or any of these other chemicals down there. So once it gets down there, it's moving. And of course, the Florida aquifer is a big mystery. You can put a well down here and put one, 100 feet away and maybe get totally different results, because it all depends on where those cavities and solution channels are in the aquifer. And that's why you have to be very careful when you start doing monitor wells, and make sure you've got a good network of them to make sure you've got a true picture of what's happening with the water in there. And if I'm wrong, I'll let my friend sitting at the end correct me, but I've been dealing with the Florida aquifer for 50 years now, and every day I learn something new about it. But it's a very difficult subject to deal with this. And when she talked about it was in the superficial aquifer, is where the heavy concentrations was. Well, that's true, but if you read any of the technical reports on the Siemens site, they'll tell you about all the wonderful sinkholes that they encountered, 15 by 20 feet. And so what happens when the water in that superficial aquifer gets to a sinkhole? Right into the Florida, the deeper aquifer, which is the one that we use for our drinking water. And so to say it's confined to the superficial, I think you may be missing the boat a little bit, because there's a hell of a lot of it in the Floridan, and that's what we need to get a handle on, because I know very few people that drink water out of the superficial. That's most, even a private well, you're getting down into the upper parts of the Floridan, and that's what you need to be concerned with, because it's a Floridan that we all depend on in this part of the state to get significant amounts of drinking water.
Is anyone testing any of the lakes around that particular site? For example, I live on Lake Nastashawon, which is 3,790 feet from that toxic site. 17 people around that Lake Nastashawon, which I understand is owned by the Timucuan HOA, has developed, died, or suffered diseases, including myself, who has cancer. I have lived on that Lake Nastashquan since 1997. My friend Paula, who lives across the street in Timucuan, in Fairway Hills, her husband died of cancer. 17 people around that area within a mile of that toxic dump area have cancer, or died of cancer, or have illnesses. One of my daughter's friends, 15 years old, lives right off of that lake, has testicular cancer. Can you tell me what is being done to test lakes, if that groundwater could be seeping in? And how ironic is it that so many people within 1 mile of that toxic plant are suffering, including myself that has cancer?
Well, I don't know where that lake is, but I do know that if you've got groundwater in the superficial aquifer, at some point in time, it can discharge to become surface water, which could be a lake or the river. Now, but I don't have any details about your lake, but it is a distinct possibility, and somebody ought to be testing.
And I recommend if you do live in Timucuan, and if you do have any ailments, Mark Nejane has been awesome in terms of representing and listening and trying to understand what's going on in regards to what can be done for the people that are currently affected, and never knew about this situation when we moved into our houses in Timucuan in 1997.
And this
Lake Timucuan?
It's Lake Nastashquan.
Oh,
It's right in the circle there. You can see it. It's a lake, and I had to call the city to try and find out the name of it, and apparently it's hidden right off of Reinhardt. Right off of Reinhardt. It's a big circle there, and it's 3,790 feet from the toxic site. Down. Over to the up.
Left.
Oh,
No.
over here?
You're on the left.
Yep.
No. This is my right. Down. East of Reinhardt. Go to the toxic site and go straight across.
Oh, right.
Okay,
Right
so go
there,
straight
go
across.
straight across.
Right
Up,
there.
up a little, over, left,
This one.
left, right there. That's the lake.
Whoa. Well, there's some monitor wells between that lake and the site. I know that. I do not know what the water quality is there, but that information is available. If you call me, I'll tell you where you might go, because I may have some data in terms of the wells you need to be looking at. The county probably has that too, but the DEP has some wells down there, monitor wells, and they're shallow, which will be the ones you need to know.
Right, and those should be tested.
Right.
They've been tested, the wells have been, I don't know the lake. I know nothing of any surface water quality measurements that have been taken by anyone.
I think that's more of a coincidence.
It sounds interesting, and I think that's something, one thing that, a question we had for Caroline was if we talked about, excuse me, Tammy, sorry, I'm going to hand you the microphone here, but we mentioned the Yale researchers who are doing a study to see the long-term impacts of 1,4-dioxane. And one of the things the researcher mentioned to Caroline is that they'd like to do this area of Seminole County as a case study for this. If someone wanted to be part of that study, what would they do?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually talked to the lead investigator just today, and he again reiterated how interested he is in hearing your experiences. So this is the lead investigator. Here is his contact information. To give you a little bit of background about the study, the National Institutes of Environmental Health gave them a $7 million grant for over the next 5 years to examine the long-term health impacts of this chemical, to try to conceptualize if it does cause cancer, how it might be causing cancer, and to come up with removal strategies to identify biomarkers that can show that you have been exposed even after it leaves your system. And a primary point of this, right, is to find people who have been drinking this for several years and follow them to see if effects turn up. So, definitely feel free to reach out to him. He mentioned that if you'd like to send him an email, just reference the Orlando Sentinel in your subject line, or, just the general area, so that he can prioritize that email and get back to you.
Thank you, thank you.
So this is a good one because we've talked a lot about our agencies trying to be more transparent about telling people about water issues. And I know that when the first testing was done, the state required that customers of water services be notified. But it basically was kind of like, there was something in your water. If you want more information, you need to call us. And that kind of goes with this question here, is like, why have city and county officials kept concerns about the contamination from citizens even in the early 2000s? Is there a way to communicate this information better to people in an understandable way going forward? Or if there isn't, would you propose that?
Well, I want a suggestion that the mayor made at the city commission meeting last night was that all the local governments, if they wanted to, could have an ordinance that if there was any type of hazardous material that was spilled, that whether it is spilled in the past or spilled in the future, require them to send notification to people. First off, you've got to quantify how much meets the standard, but then you also need to quantify how large of an area should they notify the people in. The state of Florida at one time required some notification, but then the phosphate industry went up and had the law changed, so that law is no longer applicable. But there's nothing that prevents the local governments, and I give the credit to the mayor last night at a commission meeting. The city of Sanford is going to be drafting an ordinance to provide for that type of notification. So that's, a step in the right direction, and I'm sure that we can share that with the other local governments. Of course, in the case of Lake Mary, the cow is already out of the barn, and there's not much they can do, but Seminole County and Sanford certainly can deal with this issue.
Mr. Woodruff, could you tell us more about that plan?
About the ordinance?
Yes.
It really just elevates some of the requirements that already exist and backs them up with local enforcement, that when something happens that can impact our water system, we need to know about it. And so that's something that we're looking at. Actually, we'll be looking at it at our next meeting. In answer to the earlier question about can we, give more information to the public on things, my experience in public office is you can always give more information to the public. You just never know which information they want you to give and what topics they want more information on. When this came... When this came to us, we learned that it was in the water. We learned what the levels were. We were told what the standards were and how it impacted the health and safety. Our first concerns were to make sure we maintained our water is safe. To add that, okay, here's one more chemical that we found in the water that's probably not going to affect you, to our conversation and our communication is going to get lost. Okay? What we have been focusing on is how do we keep our water system safe for our residents? Okay? We don't set those standards. The EPA, DEP set those standards, and we make sure we follow those. We always know in retrospect that we should have said more. We should have said more earlier. But I think, Kevin, when you said you first heard about this in early this year, it was one of our public meetings where we were talking about this issue.
February of this year.
January.
Was it February? Okay. Oh, excuse me. Well, 2 days off, but I'll get right. A point I want to make is we have repeated correspondence with the DEP and the Department of Health that said if we maintain the level of the 1,4-dioxin at 0.35 or less, it would not be harmful to the public's health. And I can give you document after document if you want to read it. Now, pardon? About 1996.
There were 11 homes on my street. And out of those 11 homes, there were 12 of us, including my daughter, who had cancer. Most of them were gone. I was the lucky one. My daughter was lucky, thank God. But there was something in the water. That's not a coincidence. You're talking 11 to 12 people, neighbors, having cancer. Back in 1978, we lived there for 18 years, so I'm not sure what timeline. My cancer came, we moved here in 1997, and my cancer came in 2001. And I was tested for it being hereditary. No, it wasn't in my family. I have sisters, many sisters, and my daughter had the thyroid cancer. And then there's so many young, I was 28 years old when I came. I'm now in your generation. But I was 28 years old when I came here. And I've seen a lot. But I'll tell you something, that it was no fun watching all my friends come, especially because I talked to one of my very best friends into moving into that neighborhood. And she was one of the ones that got the cancer around the corner from our street. I didn't know everybody in the whole neighborhood. I can imagine how many more, just like Timothy had cancer. So this has been going on for a long time, a long time. I lost my very best friend and my very best neighbors. It's never been the same. And you're never the same again once you have cancer. Just as Commissioner Delary was known from his, I believe, was his mother passed away from brain cancer? Yes. It has to be. It's not just, and she said I could say her name. She's an insurance agent. I won't mention her name. Her son, they lived on the Wakaiba River. Her son, at 8 years old, he was either 8 or 10, he also had developed cancer. He had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, I believe. He was also one of the lucky ones, but they lived on the river, and she saw men in white suits, almost like hazmat suits, spraying. And she went out and asked them, in the river, spraying. And she said, what are you doing? She said, the Army Corps of Engineers had us come out to spray this weed out, W-E-E-D-A-R, 210, I think it was 210, I don't know the numbers. I looked that up. That's one of the chemicals that causes cancer also. It's not just the dioxin. You have to test for more chemicals and more of these pesticides. And people are still using, which floors me, still using pesticides. Thank you, Roundup. That should be banned completely from Florida. Yes. We're trying to save Florida. We're trying to do our best to save everybody, especially our children and grandchildren. My grandson unfortunately has to rent a home. He has 2 small children, ages 5 and 1. And we went over there because we help as much as we can. When we walked in that home, this is from a renter, we painted because we had to. So we opened up the ducts.
There was so much soot, mold, and dust in there. I said, you have to get out of here. He said, I can't, I signed the lease. Not only that, I opened up the dishwasher. I looked in the sink, I looked in the tub. What was in it? Rust. Rust from the well. He's on a well. I can't test that well. I can't have that well tested. It's not my property. It's not his property. I'm concerned about their health.
And I think that's a good segue into, I think, what's going to be our last question of the night. And we've been talking about 1,4-dioxin in here, but we know there are a lot of other chemicals that are in our water. We've talked about PFAS. We've been hearing a lot about that. We're hearing a lot about other chemicals that we don't even know about yet. What can you all do to help ensure that the next time something like this pops up, that there's more transparency, that people know about it, that sort of thing? And I'd like to just go down one by one and have you guys answer that if I could, starting with you, Mr. Mayor.
You don't want Kevin to answer that?
Down the whole line. You know, obviously we need to figure out what are all the possible things we could possibly test for. And when we find them, let people know. I believe the Sentinel did stories on the Siemens plant back in the 90s. You know, the city first came to know that it was in 1,4-dioxin was in our well in 2013. Okay? So that was the earliest we even knew it was there to tell. But you also, and this is unfortunate, we have to look at what cost. You know, I actually Googled how do you test well water for 1,4-dioxane, and companies that do it, I think it's $285 for the one chemical. Okay? So we need to first be better stewards of what's getting into our water, because it's a lot less expensive and a lot easier to keep it out than it is to get it out once it's there.
So I don't have the exact answer, but I like the county's dashboard idea. Something I'm made a note, take back to our director. It's something we haven't had time to sit down and have a discussion. We have our own ways that we communicate now, but it hasn't been sufficient. So I'm going to take some ideas and see what we can come up with. And I also like to extend the offers to Sanford's employees and Seminole County's employees that come over for a tour, whatever we need to do to help show the treatment, teach the treatment, and go forward from there. So.
The Department of Health is under an obligation to issue a health advisory notice when they find contaminated water. The problem you have here is, you know, how do you define contaminated when you're dealing with 1,4-dioxin? And to me, having been in a position of some influence dealing with these kind of problems, you know, it's a line between at what point do you tell the people that there's a potential problem and you make a decision, do you tell the public or do you go solve the problem? Now, well, you know that if somebody's got to make that decision, and let me give you an example. When I was the Secretary of DER in 1979, half the population of Florida was on the verge of doing without electricity. 30 days. How many of you were in Florida in 1979, and what would you have done if you had heard that you were going to be without, half of you were going to be without electricity in 30 days? You would have probably panicked a little bit, right? Well, that burden fell on me, and as I said, I was in my second week on the job working for one Governor Bob Graham, and went to the governor's office and said, Governor, who incidentally I didn't vote for, I voted for this Republican by the name of Jack Eckerd, but I went in and said, Governor, I think you need to know about this problem. And he said, the lights are going to go off for half the people in the state of Florida in 30 days. He says, well, what do you do? And I said, Governor, I'm a water nerd. I know a little bit about air, but But I said, you start with getting the President of the United States to enter an executive order. So here I am, this redneck young guy, 37 years old, from Brooksville, Florida, and what does the governor tell me? Go in there and call the White House, okay? I said, does anybody have a telephone number for the White House? And who is it I'm supposed to ask for? President Carter? Well, as it turns out, within a week I was sitting in the White House in Washington, and I sat down with the energy czar, Schlesinger was his name, and we got the President of the United States to enter the executive order, and we went about doing our thing in Florida. And believe it or not, the lights didn't go out in 30 days. We figured out a solution to the problem. And so, in my opinion, I think we did it the right way. I didn't need people to get all upset because there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. I could do something about it, and the governor could do something about it, but individually, you couldn't do anything about it. And so when I face this, my advice, we need to solve the problem so it doesn't become a reality, because the level of water in 1,4-dioxin that Sanford was dealing with was well within the limits. And it has been about half of that 0.35 since 1916. So, you know, we were trying to solve the problem. Oh, did I say what? 1916. Oh. Picky. You know, so I'm off 100 years, you know? 2016.
You ended up with 2 microphones here. I'm not sure how exactly that worked out. How's that one?
They all came to him. Okay. As I told you, it's hard to follow Jake, right? My answer is going to be very short. As one commissioner, but I think that everybody would agree here, I think we have to get the DOH and the Department of Environmental Protection to do their job. And part of that is to, you know, we have to have more transparency. This is not just a county, and I mean county and 7 cities problem in Seminole County. This is not just a regional problem. This is a state of Florida problem. And you know, whether it be surface water, or groundwater, or the aquifer, we have contamination in all areas of our water. Secondly, and I was just talking to our consultant, I think would be a great idea, again, speaking for myself, that we get the whole county involved in this Yale study. I think that would be something that would really bring up awareness quite a bit if we could do that. But what we have already said we are going to do, I think, is very important. One was already mentioned. We are working on a dashboard that we will put with our aggressive testing, all the information about that testing on that dashboard so that everyone in Seminole County can easily go and see exactly, you know, in their area what's going on. And then we're doing our own internal and external analysis of communications so that we ensure that we have given all transparency to the people, our water customers. But it shouldn't go just for our water customers. You know, our 7 dynamic cities are, you know, we have about 250,000 people living in our cities. We have about 250,000 people living in unincorporated, but they're all citizens of Seminole County, and we have to be as transparency for the health, safety, and welfare of all of our citizens.
Does DeSantis know about this?
If he reads the newspaper, he does.
He's out of town at the moment, but
He's in Iowa at the moment.
Stay focused on water for right now. Let's.
Why isn't Sunshine Water Systems testing for this? We get a yearly report, and there's no dioxide listed. It came out recently.
No, let me answer that. It'll go faster. Sunshine Utilities is a private company, as you know. I'm not going to suggest to you that they're that we haven't had our problems with them. You know we have. Seminole County has. I am having a meeting with their president later this week, and I'll ask that exact question.
can I make one other footnote? One person we haven't mentioned. There happens to be a senator from Seminole County who is the chairman of the Senate's Environmental Committee, and I bet if people started calling him and asked him to do something, I mean, he's in the power structure of the Florida Senate. Now, I can't attest to how effective he is, but he is part of the leadership, and you know, if he started hearing from some of you folks, it might make a difference. I don't know for sure, but you know, you're looking for options, that's certainly an option.
All right, Ms. Thomas?
I'll just add that you mentioned PFAS and PFOA. This is not the only, 1,4-dioxane is not the only forever chemical that we will face in our future. And as a consultant, not necessarily representing Seminole County, but as a consultant, we advise all of our clients to identify the sources, which is something that someone else said on this panel, collect the data, be transparent, identify solutions regionally, and communicate, whether it's through this dashboard or through your elected officials. We don't know what we don't know, so bring these issues forward, and we together collectively can work harder as a region and advocate for the funding, advocate for the legal action, advocate for the regulations together.
One thing that hasn't been mentioned is the fact that how toxic this compound is. Back in the early 2000s, about 30 of the employees sued General Dynamics and Siemens, and that lawsuit was settled in 2011.
And that was with
they weren't people who were drinking the water. They were the employees that were using it.
They were, right, and our story talked about that. Those were employees at the plant that actually were using well water from underneath the plant where chemicals had seeped in, and we've done reporting on that before too. And
they were actually using
correct, water from there, which I think Martin has reported on that a lot. This has gone, sorry, we're going to have to wrap up if we can. If you make it brief.
That lawsuit is 300 and something pages. It's a public record. All those people had to sign confidentialities. So it was hidden. The reality of it, and I've got to say it, you know, I'm born and raised in Orlando. You all deserve a Pulitzer for what you've done. You've helped bring this to the forefront. Anybody believes in fake news? You didn't shut me up. So the fact is that if this would not come out but for a free press, and I'm sorry to get on a bandstand, there is not fake.
That highlights why this is such an important issue in our community. And I can say that our reporters are continuing to follow this. This is not something that we're going to stop covering because we have a lot of questions. We know you have a lot of questions as well about this. These folks for coming on the panel and answering your questions tonight. And thank you for doing that. And I'm going to turn this back over to my boss, Julie Anderson.
All right, well, I agree with that. Yeah, and thank you all for coming. we are going to continue to cover this. I'm from Orlando as well. I've lived here my whole life, and this is one of the biggest issues we've ever covered, I believe. And we're going to keep on it until we get all the answers. But it really does depend on you two to get involved and press your elected officials as well. If you want to help support us, subscribe. That's what you can do. And you can read about it here. So thank you all.